Hi there and welcome. I'm so glad you decided to stay a while. Before the flashbulbs, before the headlines, before empires broadcast their power across the globe, there was a little girl in a grand but silent palace. Small footsteps echoing through marble halls, candles flickering against high windows. A world built on ceremony, waiting for someone who never quite spoke. She wasn't supposed to rule. Not really. There were older cousins, uncles, regents, all laid out like chess pieces on a board. Yet life has its own rules. One by one, those branches of succession fell away, until at the age of 18, she quietly inherited the crown. They gave her jewels, they gave her robes, they gave her the word, Your Majesty. And she didn't speak. Not at first. This is the story of Queen Victoria. But not the loud version you might have heard in history books. Not the tale of cannon fire or conquest. Not the glittering parades or gilded medals. This is a slow bedtime journey through her world. A soft walk beneath chandeliers and dawn-lit turrets. A gentle reading of letters folded in pencil-smudged envelopes. A hushed retelling of black silk and quiet grief. Of a reign that stretched longer than her own lifetime. 63 years of sunrises and sunsets, of births and deaths, of photos and telegrams. She married the love of her life in a private ceremony. They shared whispered conversations, a treasure trove of affection hidden behind palace doors. Together they raised 9 children, each birth and christening echoing through the throne rooms and nurseries. And when tragedy struck, she wrapped herself in mourning and faded into the shadows for nearly 2 decades. Meanwhile, the world she governed curved around the globe. Her name became the banner of an empire where the sun never set. But she rarely left her island home. She ruled by letter, by telegram, by soft voice in private councils. Tonight, we'll drift through her life, not to memorize facts, but to fall asleep beside her quiet strength. We'll wander through Kensington Palace gardens drenched in dew, listen for the echo of her carriage wheels in foggy London streets, and watch the last candles burn low in Osborne House as dusk turns to night. So find your coziest spot, pull the covers up to your chin, let your mind wander at a gentle pace. We're about to follow a woman who rarely raised her voice, yet changed the world in ways that still glow today. Chapter 1. The Silent Child. Let's go back, far back to the early 1800s, to a quiet wing of Kensington Palace in London, where the air was thick with old furniture polish and careful rules, where the curtains were always drawn just enough to let in light but never allow curiosity, where the voices in the hallway walked softer than footsteps, and the nursery door always stayed half closed. She was born there on May 24, 1819. Not to applause or public bells, but to the subdued murmur of royal record-keeping and distant expectations. A small, blinking baby girl named Alexandrina Victoria, wrapped tightly in linen and placed in her mother's arms under the heavy shadow of the crown she never thought she'd wear. At the time, she was just 5th in line to the throne, far behind a scattering of older uncles and cousins, who all seemed far more likely to rule, and for that reason, that strange security of royal obscurity, her childhood was quiet, almost hidden, shaped less by the outside world and more by the soft rustle of governesses' skirts, the scent of lavender sachets in polished drawers, and the pale light that crept across the nursery floor with the turning of the morning. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, died when she was just 8 months old. A quiet illness that swept through his body in the middle of winter and left her mother, the German-born Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a widow in black silk in a foreign court, alone, except for her baby girl and the heavy rules that would soon follow. And so Victoria grew up in a household governed not by joy or exploration, but by a system, one that would later be called the Kensington system. An intricate structure of rules, curfews, chaperoned movement, and emotional restriction designed to mold her into something suitable, something proper, something royal, or at the very least, something manageable. She was never allowed to sleep in a room by herself, never allowed to walk down the stairs without holding someone's hand, never permitted to spend a moment out of sight of her mother or governess. And in that soft, suffocating silence, she learned how to be observant, how to be quiet, and how to listen to the things people didn't say. Her days were tightly structured. A wake-up call at dawn, morning lessons in languages, scripture, and music, followed by long hours of stitching samplers under the watchful eye of her German governess, Baroness Letzen, whose affection for the little princess was genuine, if a little severe. They would sit together near the high windows of the palace, Letzen reading aloud from moral instruction books while Victoria stitched carefully, her small hands working needle and thread into tidy rows. And although the world outside was changing, with carriages rattling over cobblestones and reformers marching in the streets of London, the world inside the palace remained slow, polished, and rigid. There were no companions of her own age, no carefree games, no giggling laughter behind nursery doors. Her only playmates were her half-sister Feodora, who eventually married and moved away, and her collection of dolls, carefully clothed, cataloged, and named, each one a silent audience to a girl learning how to shape control into routine. In the evenings, she sometimes sat at her little piano, her fingers pressing keys with delicate hesitation, her melodies slow and exact, not because she lacked feeling, but because she was already learning that in her life, every gesture would be observed, every expression noted, every word weighed. And yet beneath the velvet hush of her childhood, beneath the chaperoned walks through gardens, the long religious readings, and the stifling formal dinners where she was allowed to speak only when spoken to, there was something sparking. She had a sharp memory and a sharper will. She was headstrong, even as a girl, known to stubbornly refuse lessons if they didn't interest her, or burst into tears when she felt cornered. And even though her world was small, she began to ask big questions. Who decides who wears the crown? Why can't I be alone? Why must every minute of my life be controlled? By the time she was 10, she already knew something that others hoped she wouldn't. That if her uncles failed to produce legitimate heirs, which they were one by one failing to do, she would be next. And when she finally understood this, when her governess, or perhaps her mother, carefully explained the line of succession, Victoria reportedly said with a seriousness far beyond her years, "I will be good." It's a phrase that's been passed down through biographies, whispered in documentaries, printed neatly across children's history books. But in that moment, it wasn't grand or symbolic. It was quiet. A little girl, suddenly aware that her life would no longer be her own, and quietly promising herself that she would survive it. She wasn't raised in preparation to rule. She was raised in preparation to obey. But quietly, slowly, she began to resist. She pushed back against her mother's control, resented her stepfather, Sir John Conroy, who tried to insert himself as her handler and protector, and clung more tightly to Lezen, her governess, who at least seemed to love her as a person and not just a future throne. And as the years went on, and the line of succession cleared, and the voices of Parliament began to murmur her name with increasing certainty, Victoria found herself standing at the very edge of something enormous. But she didn't step forward. Not yet. She waited, watched, and wrote. Journals filled with long, reflective sentences, daily accounts, observations, and moments of feeling that had no other place to go. By the time she turned 17, her world had become smaller still. She was not allowed to walk alone, not allowed to eat without supervision, not allowed to see guests unaccompanied. Even as the weight of a nation began to press invisibly against her narrow shoulders, she was a girl on the edge of becoming something else, and everyone in the palace knew it. And then, her uncle, King William IV, grew ill, and the world she had been raised to accept, that cold, silent, rule-bound world of others deciding on her behalf, began to tremble. Because the crown, long distant and abstract, was now only one heartbeat away. And the next time we open the page, she won't be a child anymore. She will be queen. Chapter 2, The Crown at 18. Let's go back. Not just in years, but into the soft, turning hush of history. To a morning wrapped in gray London mist, where the palace windows hadn't yet warmed with light, and a 17-year-old girl was still asleep beneath embroidered sheets, unaware that her life and the empire was about to shift. It was June 20th, 1837, just past dawn. Outside, the streets of London were quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. And inside Kensington Palace, in a quiet corner of the royal apartments, a gentle knock came at the door. Two men stood waiting. One was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the other Lord Conyngham. Their faces were drawn not from fatigue, but from the weight of what they had come to say. The King, William IV, had died in the night. The line had passed. The silence was over, and now the girl sleeping upstairs was queen. Her mother entered the room first, gently rousing her, telling her that men had come, not with trouble, but with something final. Victoria rose, quickly and calmly. She changed into a white morning dress, still half caught between sleep and history. When she entered the drawing room, and the two men bowed low before her, she did not flinch. She listened, she nodded, and when they rose and addressed her as Your Majesty, she accepted it with the stillness of someone who had long imagined the moment but never thought it would come so soon. That day she recorded only one sentence in her journal: I am queen. No flourish, no emotion, just the truth, quiet, profound, and irreversible. From that moment on, the world around her moved quickly. There were carriages arriving, ministers convening, black dresses being sewn and white gloves being buttoned, letters sent across oceans, banners folded, portraits draped, curtains drawn. Morning began before breakfast, but inside her, something slower began to settle. Something not quite fear, not quite pride, but the first feeling of authority brushing softly against her edges. She was no longer under anyone's control. Not her mother's, not Sir John Conroy's, not even Lazen's, though she would remain close. She would now eat when she wished, walk where she pleased, speak when she chose. But more than that, she would be seen. And yet, even as she moved into power, she did not move with noise. She chose Buckingham Palace for her residence, a space she had never truly lived in before, dusty and stiff and filled with drafts. But it was hers, no longer Kensington, no longer shadowed by the weight of others. Her mother would have rooms nearby, but no longer share hers. That line, perhaps the first real boundary of her adult life, was drawn cleanly and without anger. She asked for quiet, for space, for time to breathe, and she was given it. Her first meetings as queen were careful, quiet affairs. She met with the Privy Council, a room full of men twice her age, seasoned and skeptical, and she sat small and still among them, listening to advice, nodding when appropriate, signing where necessary. But they noticed something. Beneath the youth, beneath the pale cheeks and the gloved hands, there was calm. She did not fidget. She did not tremble. She simply took it all in. Every name, every word, every motion, and stored it carefully, thread by thread, like the needlework of her girlhood, now transformed into governance. She wrote more now, journals, letters, long paragraphs in her slanted hand, noting the tone of a minister's voice, the way a certain document was phrased, her own feelings as she stood in state for the first time. There was no crown in those pages, only thought, emotion, record. And in those words we begin to hear her not as a ruler, but as a person becoming one. In public she remained composed. She wore mourning black with quiet dignity. She walked with a steady step. She spoke softly when addressed. And for those first few months, the country, unsure what a girl queen would bring, watched her not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity. Then came the coronation. It was held on June 28, 1838, just over a year after she became queen. The day was brilliant and long. Horses clattered through the streets. Trumpets sounded at intervals. The crowd pressed 10 layers deep at the gates, shouted not out of loyalty yet, but out of awe, the kind that comes when one realizes they are seeing something truly new. Inside Westminster Abbey, she walked the long nave alone. Her train stretched behind her, 20 yards of gold-embroidered silk carried by noblewomen and sewn with symbolism. She looked ahead, eyes steady. Not bold, not cold, just present. When the Archbishop lowered the crown onto her head, she did not shift. But she felt it, the weight, yes, but also the pause in the air, as if the old world had exhaled, and the new one had not yet drawn breath. In the years that followed, Victoria would grow more confident, but not yet. She remained guarded in those early seasons. She clung to Lord Melbourne, her first Prime Minister, as a mentor, a gentle guide through the rituals of politics. He spoke with patience. He counseled without pressure. And she, in turn, listened with an intensity that surprised everyone. Their relationship raised whispers, not scandalous ones, but speculative. Was he too close? Was she too dependent? But for a young woman who had never before been allowed to choose her own companions, her own teachers, her own path, Melbourne was not just a political ally. He was freedom, the first man she trusted to tell her the truth without trying to shape her. And through him, she began to shape herself. There were early missteps, small ones, public tensions with her mother, a dismissal of certain ladies-in-waiting that drew criticism, her resistance to certain court protocols. But she endured it all with a quiet, growing resolve. She did not raise her voice. She did not rush. She simply learned. In private, she still ached for something more. At night, in her journals, she sometimes described dreams of walking freely in a garden, of hearing her name spoken, not as a title, but as a whisper, of letters, of someone writing back. She had met him once, years before, a cousin from Germany, a soft-spoken young man with serious eyes and an interest in music, astronomy, and books. His name was Albert, and now in the silence of her palace, she began to think of him more often. There were letters exchanged, then an invitation, and soon, a visit. But that story begins not here, in the chamber of state or the streets of coronation, But in the drawing room of Buckingham Palace, where a queen, barely out of girlhood, was about to open the door, not to a statesman, not to a subject, but to someone who would change the texture of her life. And that, dear listener, is where we'll go next. Chapter 3. Albert's Arrival. Let's begin with a letter. Bolded crisply, written in dark ink on pale cream parchment, sealed with a family crest still warm from the wax. It is 1839, and the letter has crossed the channel, passed through customs, and been carried in the careful hands of a royal courier to Buckingham Palace, where Queen Victoria waits with the kind of quiet anticipation that sits low in the chest, like breath held for too long. The letter is from Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, her cousin by blood, her companion by destiny, and the quiet echo from a meeting years before, one she remembered more clearly than she ever admitted. He was coming, not to propose, not yet, but to visit. And from the moment she read those words, the tempo of her days changed. She remembered him. Not in perfect detail, but in impression. The last time they met, she had been just 17. He, 2 years younger, had been shy but serious, with thick eyebrows and a gaze that felt older than his face. They'd spent only a few days together, in carefully arranged encounters orchestrated by family politics and royal matchmaking. But something had lingered. Not infatuation. Not yet. Something quieter. A familiarity, a pull. And now 2 years later, he was on his way to England again. Not as a stranger, not quite as a suitor, but as a possibility. The arrival was modest by royal standards. No trumpets, no public displays. Albert stepped down from the carriage in a fitted traveling coat, boots dulled from the road, and a hat held respectfully in his hand. His brother Ernest came with him, older, more outwardly confident. But it was Albert whose presence hung in the air like a question not yet answered. Victoria met him in the drawing room. She wore soft blue, her favorite color, with her hair arranged simply, her expression composed, but her hands folded tightly in her lap. When he entered, they bowed to one another, formally, politely, as the room observed. And then they spoke. What passed between them in those first hours is mostly left to history's margins. Letters speak only of conversations and shared walks. But in her journal that evening, Victoria wrote something different. It was with some emotion that I beheld Albert, so grown, so handsome. It gave me a feeling I cannot describe. The words are modest, but in her heart, something had already shifted. Within days, her affection had bloomed into certainty. And on October 15th, 1839, just 5 days after his arrival, Victoria asked him to marry her. It may seem strange, a queen proposing to a prince, but as sovereign, it was her role to ask. And when she did, he accepted with quiet grace, his voice low, his eyes warm. There was no grand gesture, no kneeling, just two people in a sunlit room softly agreeing to spend the rest of their lives intertwined. The engagement was announced formally, and the reaction was mixed. The public at first was uncertain. Albert was foreign, young, and Protestant, 3 things that made portions of British society wary. Some feared he would interfere with politics. Others doubted his strength beside such a powerful woman. But Victoria was firm. She defended him in letters and at court. She made it clear that though he would not rule, his presence would be central, not just to her, but to the structure of her life. He would not be ornamental. He would be her partner. They were married on February 10th, 1840. at the Chapel Royal in St. Forta, James's palace. It was a grey day, overcast and drizzling, the kind of London morning that blurred outlines and dampened lace. But inside, everything glowed. Victoria wore white satin, a color not yet traditional for weddings, and a simple wreath of orange blossoms in her hair. Her veil was long, her face was radiant, and her hands trembled as she reached for his. Albert wore a British Field Marshal's uniform, elegant, structured, and symbolic of his new place in her world. The ceremony was brief, sacred, and tender. When it was over, they returned to Buckingham Palace as husband and wife. Ceremonial entry. In the days that followed, she called him dearest and my angel in nearly every journal entry. She clung to him, not with desperation, but with the joy of someone who had never truly chosen anyone before. He calmed her when she was flustered. He steadied her when public duty made her anxious. He brought order to the chaos of her emotions and systems to the palace's clutter, and quietly, gently, he became the second half of her reign. Albert was not loud. He was not theatrical. He moved carefully through court life, observing, learning, adapting. He studied British law, he worked on charitable causes, he championed education, science, architecture. He helped organize royal finances. Behind the scenes, he was a quiet force, not just a consort, but a reformer. And slowly, the public began to see it. They watched him with less suspicion and more interest. But beyond politics and public affairs, their home life mattered most to her. In their private apartments, they shared music. Books, letters, walks in the garden, even in the rain. He taught her about astronomy. She read him lines from novels. They played duets. They held hands behind columns. And when they were apart, even briefly, they wrote to one another daily. She needed him, not just for companionship, but for anchoring. She had ruled alone. Now she ruled with someone who saw her not as a crown, but as a woman. In November of 1840, their first child, Princess Victoria, was born, and with that, their private world began to expand. More children would follow, 9 in all. But even in those early days of parenthood, something had settled between them. A shared rhythm, a quiet understanding, a household built not on protocol, but on love. More children would always be easy. It would not always be arguments, disagreements. There would be grief, eventually. But in those first years of marriage, soft and glowing and filled with purpose, Victoria was not just queen, she was beloved. And she was no longer alone, but a family. In the next chapter, we'll step into that household. Not the grand throne rooms, but the nurseries, the quiet corridors, the garden paths. We'll see what it meant to rule, not a country, but a family. And how, for Victoria, that was the reign she never saw coming. Chapter 4. Love in the Courtroom. Let's return now, not to marble halls or golden carriages, but to soft footsteps on polished floors, to the rustle of papers, to the hush of a nursery, and the sound of laughter behind heavy velvet curtains. This is the quietest part of a queen's reign. Not the part most remembered in history books, but perhaps the part she herself held closest. The life they built together, not just as sovereign and consort, but as husband and wife, as parents, as partners in the long, slow project of family. Victoria had always been watched. Every word, every appearance, every decision, observed and recorded. But in Albert, she found someone who didn't just watch, he understood. After their marriage in 1840, Buckingham Palace began to take on a different rhythm. Where once it had been a place of rigid formality and solitary duty, it became something warmer. A place where music drifted from drawing rooms and children's voices echoed faintly down tiled corridors. Albert was a quiet force behind the curtain of monarchy. He never sought the spotlight, but he moved through the machinery of the royal household with precision. He reorganized staff, balanced the books, introduced new systems for record-keeping, security, and communication. Where others might have imposed with ego, Albert built with quiet care. Victoria admired it deeply. She often wrote in her journals of his dedication, his calm, his ability to work tirelessly without complaint. He was, she said, her everything. But love inside a palace is never without pressure. From the beginning, the court had been unsure of him. He had no official role, no constitutional authority. He was a prince without a title, a husband with no voice in parliament. And yet, he was in every room. Albert sat beside her during meetings, drafted speeches, advised on appointments. He studied British law with scholarly devotion, asked thoughtful questions of ministers, and kept up with international affairs in 4 languages. He was not ornamental, he was essential. Still, some in government bristled. They whispered that he was interfering, that he was too serious, too German, too present. But Victoria was firm. She made it known that Albert's counsel mattered, that he was her equal in thought, even if not in law, that his presence was not a shadow but a pillar. Together, they presented a united front. Where Victoria was emotional, Albert was logical. Where she acted on feeling, he responded with structure. She once described him as her compass, always pointing her inward, back to clarity. Their private arguments, and there were many, often centered on just that difference. Victoria, so used to being adored and deferred to, would sometimes bristle at Albert's calm corrections. She felt things deeply. He, by contrast, approached problems like puzzles to be solved. There were tears, raised voices, letters sent and later torn up. But through it all, they always returned to each other, as if the tension was simply part of the pattern they'd stitched between them. By the end of 1843, their household had begun to grow. First came Victoria, then Albert Edward, later to be Edward VII, followed by Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. 9 children in all. Each with their own rooms, nurses, tutors, and tailored expectations. But Victoria was no distant matriarch. She was deeply attached to her children, especially in their early years, and often filled pages of her journal describing their personalities, first words, illnesses, and preferences. She delighted in their company, though she also found motherhood exhausting and, at times, frustrating. Albert, meanwhile, brought his organizational mind to parenting. He designed educational schedules, insisted on discipline, and believed in the value of rigorous training, especially for the boys. He saw their children not just as heirs, but as instruments for the future of Europe, a royal family that could serve as an example of virtue, learning, and unity. Live among gardens, they made a home together at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, a warm, sun-filled retreat where they could step away from the demands of the city and live among gardens, books, and the sounds of waves outside their windows. At Osborne, they were not just queen and prince, they were simply mama and papa. Victoria took long walks in the gardens with the youngest children. Albert designed a new wing for the house. They painted, sketched, read aloud, and wrote letters side by side. It was a world of quiet intention, one they built with care. But beyond their household, the empire moved on. The 1840s were not quiet elsewhere. There were revolutions across Europe, political unrest at home, famine in Ireland, and each of these matters filtered into their lives through daily briefings, reports, and newspaper clippings. Albert, always alert, became more involved in policy. Victoria, while still emotionally driven, leaned into his knowledge. They debated, consulted, reflected. Together, they governed, not in the official sense, but in a way that blended their strengths. She was the heart, he was the mind. And through it all, their love endured, not untouched by strain, but deepened by it. She continued to adore him, sometimes with a fierceness that made her insecure, especially when she sensed his mood shift or his attention turn elsewhere. She could be possessive, moody, jealous of the time he gave to causes or correspondence. But Albert never withdrew. Even in frustration, he remained steady. Their letters during absences are filled with warmth, longing, daily updates, affectionate scoldings, and reassurances. They were two people who chose each other again and again, not because it was easy, but because it was true. In time, their partnership became admired, even envied, not just because it was loving, but because it worked. Victoria had begun her reign alone. Now, with Albert beside her, she had reshaped what monarchy could look like, not as a cold institution, but as a home. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the world around them began to shift. Because even the quietest love must weather change, and not every sunrise in the palace would come with peace. But for now, in the still rooms of Osborne, with children laughing in the hall and letters waiting by the candle, Victoria was, for the first time in her life, entirely beautifully content. Chapter 5: The Day the Curtains Closed. Let's begin with a silence, not the kind that follows an argument or the kind that settles before applause. This one is different, a silence so thick it feels like velvet, the kind that fills a room when something enormous has left it. It is December of 1861, and Queen Victoria's world is about to unravel. For years, Albert had been her constant, her husband, her anchor, her advisor, her balance. In every room where decisions were made, he had stood just behind her, not loudly, not with ceremony, but with presence, with steadiness. But Albert had been growing tired, quietly, gradually. The weight he carried day after day, the court business, the reforms, the children, the diplomacy, the Queen's emotions, had begun to wear down even his careful frame. He did not complain. He never did. But the signs were there, a stiffness in his posture, the shadows beneath his eyes, the way his pen rested longer between lines of ink. Victoria noticed, but she didn't see. She was busy, with court, with family, with worry. And Albert, ever private, kept the worst of it to himself. In November of 1861, Albert fell ill. At first it seemed mild, a chill, a fever, fatigue, but it worsened quickly. Doctors arrived. They called it typhoid fever, a word that even then carried weight. He was moved to Windsor Castle, to a quiet room where the windows stayed drawn and the air was heavy with dampness and the scent of linen and old stone. Victoria stayed near him constantly. She held his hand, read to him, smoothed his hair. She prayed. She refused to believe. She whispered hope through every corridor. But Albert's breath began to slow. His skin grew pale. his words slurred. And on the night of December 14, 1861, he closed his eyes and did not open them again. He was 42 years old. Victoria did not scream. She did not faint. She simply broke inward, quietly, completely. That night, and for all the nights that followed, something in her dimmed. The country mourned him. Flags lowered. Newspapers published long, grieving columns. Bells tolled across cities and villages. Black crepe was tied to doorposts. But no mourning matched the Queen's. She retreated almost immediately. From court, from public life, from light. She wore black that day. And she would wear black every day for the next 40 years. Not as a symbol, but as a second skin. The halls of the palace changed. Mirrors were covered, curtains remained drawn, servants spoke in whispers. Piano music ceased. Albert's dressing room was left untouched, his books undisturbed. His pen still rested in a glass tray beside his writing desk. Fresh flowers were placed there daily, not because he would return, but because she could not bear to stop pretending he might. She wrote letters to him, long, aching entries in her journal as if he were still reading. She addressed her thoughts to him in official documents. When she sat at her desk, she left a space beside her chair. She often referred to herself not as the Queen, but as the widow of Albert. The children felt it too. Their father, the thoughtful, precise, guiding presence, was gone. And their mother, once warm in the early years of their childhood, now drifted further and further into silence. She became stern, easily wounded, quick to isolate. She loved them, but grieved too loudly to always show it. Some grew up resentful of her distance. Others simply accepted it as part of the palace air. Politicians grew restless. With the Queen in retreat, governance continued under ministers, and the monarchy, though still powerful in symbolism, became less present in the daily business of the people. Criticism grew. Satirical papers mocked her absence. Republic-minded voices whispered that perhaps Britain no longer needed a queen. But she did not return. She remained at Osborne, at Balmoral, in widowhood. Years passed. Prime ministers changed. Events unfolded. Wars, treaties, technologies. Still, she grieved. But even grief cannot be infinite. Gradually, very gradually, she began to step out again. Not into the full light, but into its edges. She appeared at select events. She allowed herself to be photographed. She spoke with ministers quietly but firmly, and in the background, she kept Albert alive through his memorials, through statues, through chapels, through books. She commissioned portraits of him, funded institutions in his name, built the Royal Albert Hall as a tribute, named parks, scholarships, and libraries in his memory. She did not replace him. She never even tried. Other men served her, John Brown, later Abdul Karim, as attendants, as confidants, as gentle comforts in years when solitude pressed too tightly. But no one was ever him. Albert's portrait hung in every room. His robe stayed folded at the foot of his bed. His name remained in every prayer she whispered before sleep. Grief changed her. It narrowed her world, but it also shaped her legacy. The image of Victoria in black became iconic, not just as a widow, but as a symbol of constancy, of devotion, of a woman who had loved so deeply that even an empire could not distract her. And as time passed, the people began to see that too. They pitied her, then respected her. Then, in a quiet turn, they loved her for it. But Albert was gone, and she never stopped missing him. Not on Christmas, not on birthdays, not when new inventions arrived, not when her children married or when their children were born, not when she stood in crowds and heard her anthem played, not when the empire expanded. Always she thought he should have seen this. In the next chapter, we'll watch the Queen step carefully into a world where Albert is only memory. The empire will grow, the world will turn, and Victoria, always dressed in black, will walk forward, slowly, but not the same, never the same. Chapter 6. The people gently waited. In the years that followed Prince Albert's death in December of 1861, Queen Victoria entered a period of mourning that was not only deeply personal, but also quietly reshaped the relationship between the monarchy and the British public. Not through scandal or political upheaval, but through absence, through silence, and through the gradual adjustment of expectations, both within court circles and across the wider empire. For Victoria, grief did not arrive in stages or pass on a timetable. It lingered. It settled into the fabric of her daily routines and never fully lifted. She withdrew from nearly all public ceremonial life, finding comfort in familiar places, particularly Osborne House on the Isle of Wight and Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands, both residences that she and Albert had cherished together and which now offered the quiet she seemed to need in order to continue. During those early years, she still read dispatches, met occasionally with ministers, and remained informed on governmental matters, but she did so in private, through letters, through memoranda, through quiet rooms far from the bustling corridors of Parliament or the ornate stages of state ceremonies. Her role became more reserved, more remote, and while constitutional governance carried on through her ministers, the symbol of the crown grew noticeably quieter. Initially, the public response was empathetic. The Queen had lost not only a husband, but a central figure in her life, both emotionally and politically. Albert had been admired by many, especially for his commitment to education, social reform, and the arts, and his passing at the age of 42 had been widely mourned. But as months turned into years, the understanding that had first surrounded Victoria's grief began to give way to uncertainty. A kind of national wondering about whether she would ever truly re-emerge. Throughout the 1860s, she made few public appearances. She did not open Parliament in person. She rarely appeared at royal ceremonies or national commemorations. For many Britons, especially those who lived in London or followed the royal family through newspapers, the Queen became something of an abstract presence, known but rarely seen. Some members of the press began to question whether such prolonged seclusion was appropriate for a sovereign. Cartoonists, particularly those in publications like Punch, depicted her as distant and shadowed. A growing Republican sentiment, though still marginal, occasionally used her invisibility as a reason to debate the role of the monarchy in an evolving modern society. Still, the majority of her subjects continued to regard her with sympathy, if not complete understanding. The monarchy during this time remained stable, largely due to the efforts of prime ministers like Lord Palmerston and later William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli, who handled political leadership with steady hands. But the institution did feel quieter, more subdued, almost suspended in the long echo of Victoria's grief. Her family, too, moved forward. Her children married, often into other royal families of Europe, further intertwining Victoria's legacy with that of the continent. Her eldest daughter, also named Victoria, married Prince Friedrich of Prussia. Her eldest son, Albert Edward, the future King Edward VII, caused Victoria frequent concern with his social habits and liberal leanings, but he also took on more ceremonial roles in his mother's absence. Through all of this, Victoria remained involved, reading letters daily, issuing instructions, and keeping close watch over the monarchy's image. But she did so from a distance, preferring the handwritten page to the crowded ballroom, the quiet garden path to the clamor of public events. By the early 1870s, one man had become especially prominent in her private life: John Brown, a Scottish servant and former outdoor attendant to Prince Albert at Balmoral. He was loyal, direct, and practical, and over time became one of Victoria's most trusted confidants. He accompanied her on walks, guarded her privacy fiercely, and spoke to her with a plainness that few dared. Their relationship, while entirely personal and non-political, became the subject of rumor and speculation, something Victoria disliked intensely. But she defended Brown's role in her household until his death in 1883. With his company and the passage of time, Victoria began to appear more frequently in public again, never shedding her black mourning attire, but stepping cautiously back into view. In 1866, she laid the foundation stone for what would become the Royal Albert Hall, a memorial project that helped frame Albert's legacy not as a private memory, but as part of the nation's cultural fabric. Over the next 2 decades, Victoria's return was steady, though never rushed. She resumed state openings of Parliament, began to receive foreign dignitaries again, and took part in more formal occasions. Each appearance was carefully managed, and though she remained visibly reserved and dressed in mourning, her presence helped reassure the public that the monarchy still stood, not unchanged, but enduring. In 1877, Victoria accepted the additional title of Empress of India, a decision largely influenced by Prime Minister Disraeli and tied closely to Britain's colonial expansion. Though she never visited India herself, the title marked an important symbolic chapter in her reign, and it began to solidify a new kind of imperial identity around the crown, one that extended well beyond the British Isles. By the time her Golden Jubilee arrived in 1887, marking 50 years on the throne, Victoria had become something else entirely. No longer the young, blushing queen of the early portraits, nor the silent widow of the 1860s, she was now a kind of living symbol. The grandmother of Europe, a figure both familiar and distant, wrapped in black silk and memory, but also in the quiet respect of a people who had waited for her and never quite let her go. That jubilee brought out millions in quiet celebration. Streets filled, banners rose, choirs sang. But still, her presence was gentle. She waved, she smiled faintly, she nodded her thanks. She remained quiet, but no longer hidden. Her people, after all those years, had not abandoned her. And she, after all that silence, had found her way back. Not by returning to who she had been, but by becoming something different, something quieter, something constant, something very nearly eternal. Chapter 7: The Shadow of Empire. By the middle of Queen Victoria's reign, the map of the world had begun to take on a distinctly British hue. The outlines of continents were increasingly marked with red and pink, the visual shorthand for British dominion, and while Victoria herself was not the architect of these far-reaching acquisitions, her name and image became their enduring symbol. She did not sail across oceans or draft colonial blueprints. but her portrait hung in government halls from Calcutta to Cape Town. Her signature rested at the foot of imperial appointments, and her silence, long, steady, and deeply Victorian, lent a kind of dignity to an empire that was as complicated as it was vast. Victoria was not, in temperament or taste, an imperial crusader. She preferred the domestic to the foreign, the personal to the political. Her daily life revolved around family correspondence, court routines, and the slow rituals of monarchy. She enjoyed her dogs, her sketchbooks, her Highland walks. Her worldview was largely shaped by what was brought to her through letters, portraits, maps, and reports, rather than what she saw firsthand. But as Britain's reach extended, so too did her symbolic reign. Without traveling far from Windsor or Balmoral, she became, by title and by perception, a global figure. The British Empire during her reign grew into the largest empire the world had ever seen. Its territories spanned continents, from Canada to India, Australia to Africa, the Caribbean to Southeast Asia. Through conquest, treaties, economic pressure, and colonization, Britain established control over millions of people, creating a network of trade, governance, and communication that linked places separated by oceans and centuries of history. Railways were built, crops exported, languages taught and erased. And while much of this was orchestrated by politicians, soldiers, merchants, and administrators, it was Victoria who appeared at the center of the imperial imagination. Calm, constant, unchanging. Her role in the governance of the empire was primarily ceremonial. She was kept informed, briefed regularly by her prime ministers and colonial secretaries, and she signed off on formalities. But she was not involved in the day-to-day decision-making. Her interest, however, was genuine, particularly in India, which came to occupy a unique place in her mind and heart. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which marked a turning point in British control of the subcontinent, governance was transferred from the East India Company directly to the Crown. In this transition, Victoria became, in a new and formal sense, the sovereign of India. It was a role she approached with personal care. She expressed compassion for her Indian subjects in her writings, often referring to them as my people, though her understanding of the region remained shaped by British sources. In 1877, under the guidance of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, she accepted the title Empress of India, a ceremonial distinction meant to assert Britain's authority and align her image with imperial grandeur. The title, while largely symbolic, was deeply significant. It marked the Queen not only as a constitutional monarch of a European kingdom, but as a global figurehead presiding over an empire of extraordinary cultural and geographic diversity. Victoria did not take this role lightly. She began to receive more Indian visitors at court. She commissioned Indian-style furnishings and architectural designs. And perhaps most famously, she developed a close friendship with Abdul Karim, a young Indian clerk presented to her in 1887. Karim taught her Urdu, introduced her to aspects of Indian culture, and became a daily part of her life at court. Their relationship, much like her earlier closeness with John Brown, was met with skepticism and disapproval by many in the royal household. Yet Victoria defended him firmly, insisting on his dignity and place within her personal circle. Through Karim, whom she called the Munshi, meaning teacher, India became less of an abstraction. It became a living presence in her daily routine. Though her understanding of colonial realities remained filtered through layers of deference and idealism, she came to see India as not just a subject of policy, but a part of her identity as monarch. In her later years, she signed her name as Victoria Ri, Regina et Imperatrix, Queen and Empress. At home, the empire was a source of both pride and complexity. The wealth it generated was visible in Britain's growing cities, in its exhibitions and industries, in the flow of goods from around the world. Yet its expansion also raised moral and political questions. Critics debated the ethics of colonization, the treatment of native populations, and the contradictions between imperial rule and British ideals of liberty. But to most of her subjects, Victoria herself remained beyond the reach of controversy. Her distance made her safe. Her mourning clothes, her quiet routines, and her long memory gave her an image of permanence that empire, with all its instability, could anchor itself to. She was not a ruler of conquest. She was a ruler of continuity. And that, in many ways, was what the empire needed her to be. As telegraph cables linked continents and steamboats shrank oceans, Victoria became a global presence not through movement, but through symbolism. She was printed on banknotes and postage stamps. Her likeness adorned portraits in colonial schools and railway offices. Her jubilee was marked not only in London, but in Nairobi, Delhi, Melbourne, and Kingston. She stood at the center of a world that was changing faster than any monarch before her had witnessed, and she stood still. There is a quiet irony in her place within the empire. While she rarely left Britain, while she mourned in solitude and treasured domestic order, she nonetheless came to represent an empire of ships and soldiers, of factories and plantations, of trade routes and treaties. She ruled a world she would never touch, and yet her signature passed over all of it. And perhaps it was that stillness, that quiet, that made her reign so enduring. In an age of motion, she remained in place. In an age of expansion, she became the axis. By the 1890s, her empire had grown so large that the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," had become common. And wherever that sun moved across maps and time zones, there was always a framed portrait, a formal greeting, or a whispered oath spoken in her name. She did not shape it, but it bore her shape. And through all its complexities, its grandeur and its grief, its progress and its prejudice, she remained its emblem. Not because she commanded it, but because she endured it, quietly, constantly, as always. Chapter 8: Old Bones, New Century. By the time the century began to shift and turn toward its final decade, Queen Victoria had long ceased to be merely a ruler. She had become something else entirely, something more enduring than policy or power, more symbolic than ceremonial. She had become, for an empire and for generations who had only ever known her reign, a living monument to the passing of time itself. Her image no longer represented the promise of youth or the ambition of conquest, but instead the quiet dignity of longevity, of bearing witness to a world that had changed almost completely since the day she first took the throne. In 1837, she had begun her reign with cautious steps and youthful blush. In 1890, she moved with care not only for her steps, but for the weight of memory that each step carried. She had seen railways laid across Britain and telegraph lines pulled across continents. She had witnessed the rise of industry, the movement of millions into cities, and the first murmurs of the modern age. She had corresponded with American presidents and Ottoman sultans, had outlived emperors and composers, and seen the world shrink from oceans apart to days by train or signal. Victoria's world in the 1890s was smaller in physical scale. She traveled less, moved more slowly, spent more time seated by familiar fires in Windsor, Osborne, or Balmoral, but it was vast in what it held. Her grandchildren wrote to her from all over Europe. Her ministers came and went, many of them born long after her coronation. She watched as the world outside her windows changed its shape. Not suddenly, but slowly, through new inventions, new politics, and a society that looked toward the future even as it bowed to her as its past. Her household remained, in many ways, as it had always been. Servants were trained in the old manner, quiet, invisible, precise. Meals followed familiar courses. Letters were read by candlelight. But there were small changes too. Electric lighting began to creep into royal residences. A telephone line was installed, though Victoria rarely used it. Motor cars were seen outside palace gates, though she preferred the quiet of carriages and horses. New newspapers arrived daily, printing images captured by camera rather than drawn by hand. The world, even in the royal household, could no longer resist modernity. But it arrived gently, as if knowing the Queen needed no suddenness in her final years. Her health, though never robust, was steady. She moved with increasing slowness and needed help mounting stairs or entering carriages, but she remained alert and engaged. Her eyesight had faded slightly, her hearing softened, and she tired more easily in the afternoons, but her mind was still sharp. She continued to meet with ministers, to read dispatches, and to sign documents in a hand that had grown more deliberate. She remembered names with startling accuracy. She asked after the families of her staff. She noticed small changes, a new haircut, a changed uniform, a child's absence from a photograph. She remained, in every sense, aware. She also remained surrounded by family, a family that had grown not only in size, but in complexity. Her children had long since established their own households and titles. Her grandchildren, now young adults, were dispersed across Europe's courts. Her family tree included the future kings of Britain, Germany, Norway, and Spain. She had become, through marriage and alliance, the grandmother of a continent. They wrote to her, visited when they could, and spoke of her with both reverence and caution. She was not a matriarch in the warm, open sense of the word. Her relationships were formal, often filtered through protocol. But she was, unquestionably, their central figure. She continued to mourn, in her own way. The black dresses remained. The jewelry was modest. Her daily routine still included a moment of remembrance for Prince Albert. She had his rooms kept as they were. His photographs remained on her desks and beside her bed. In moments of fatigue or solitude, she would sometimes speak to him, or at least to his memory, not dramatically, but quietly, as one might recall a voice they have memorized. And still, she governed. In 1897, she marked 60 years on the throne, her Diamond Jubilee. It was not a celebration she had planned or particularly desired, but it unfolded with a grandeur that few in history have known. Across Britain and across the empire, cities held parades, churches rang bells, children learned songs. In London, a procession brought thousands into the streets. Carriages passed beneath triumphal arches, bands played anthems, and crowds stood shoulder to shoulder just to catch a glimpse of her. Not for her words, which had grown few, but for the presence of someone who had been there all their lives. Victoria sat in her open coach, dressed in black as always, but wearing a white cap that had come to symbolize her later years, a crown not of gold, but of soft cotton lace. She did not wave with extravagance. She did not smile often, but she looked and she nodded, and she gave the quiet blessing of her presence. To many, it was a farewell in all but name. The years after the Jubilee were quieter. Victoria traveled even less. Her walks shortened, she rested more often. But she continued to take interest in the affairs of her ministers. She followed the Boer War in South Africa with particular concern, a conflict she did not initiate and could not control, but which weighed heavily on her as lives were lost and criticisms mounted. She wrote to soldiers she mourned publicly for the fallen, and in her notes she expressed both pride in duty and sorrow at the cost. By 1900, her health had begun to decline more noticeably. She suffered from rheumatism, fatigue, and occasional confusion. Her appetite lessened, and she became increasingly frail. Yet she still rose in the mornings, sat at her desk, and reviewed what papers she could. The room was quieter now. The staff older, the world faster. But she remained smaller, slower, and more tired, but still the same. In the final weeks of her life, she returned to Osborne House, the residence she had built with Albert decades earlier. The rooms there were familiar, filled with memories and soft light. She sat by the windows, listened to the sea, wrote a few final letters, received her doctor with a calm expression. And gradually, she slipped into the deeper stillness that comes at the very end of a long life. Queen Victoria died on January 22, 1901, at the age of 81. At her bedside were her son, the future King Edward VII, and her grandson Wilhelm, the Kaiser of Germany. Around her were photographs of her children and Albert. On her finger was a ring he had given her, and beside her pillow were a few mementos she had carried for years: a lock of his hair, a small handkerchief, a note. She passed in silence, with no last proclamation, no dramatic gesture. Only breath, then stillness. Her funeral, held at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, was grand but not ostentatious. She had made it known that she did not wish for excessive mourning. Her coffin was draped not in black but in white, topped with her regimental flag. She was buried beside Albert in the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, as she had long wished. And with her passing, the Victorian Era, that long, slow, complex stretch of time that had shaped so much of the modern world, quietly came to a close. She had reigned for over 63 years, longer than any monarch before her, and during that time had lived through revolutions in technology, politics, industry, medicine, and art. She had seen the world grow smaller and the empire grow larger. She had outlived the century that gave her its name. But in the end, she left not with ceremony, but with quiet, as she had lived, as she had reigned, softly, steadily, still. Chapter 9. The Legacy She Left Behind. Victoria's passing marked the end of an era that had shaped both an empire and a monarch. Her death in 1901 did not bring with it the sharpness of shock or the grandeur of state declarations. It simply came quietly, like the soft fading of a melody whose notes had slowly stretched across 63 years. Her reign, the longest in British history at the time, had seen the world change in ways that no one could have imagined when she first ascended to the throne. But it wasn't just the empire that was altered by her rule. The very nature of monarchy itself had shifted under her gaze. The 19th century had begun with the slow, majestic gestures of kings and queens who lived at the center of an ever-expanding, complicated empire. But by the time Victoria's reign drew to a close, monarchy had become less a force of absolute power and more a symbol of stability, continuity, and tradition in a world increasingly filled with tumult and change. Victoria's family, her children and grandchildren scattered across Europe would each inherit a piece of her legacy, but no one could claim it entirely. Her son, Edward VII, succeeded her as king, but he was very much his own man, with his own politics and his own style of leadership. He had been anointed long before his mother's death, and though he bore the weight of the crown with confidence, it was never quite the same as his mother's quiet, unyielding reign. Edward VII's reign ushered in the Edwardian era, which, though shaped by the reverence of Victoria's memory, marked a departure from the Victorian traditions. The world that Edward stepped into was one of growing industrialism, scientific progress, and global conflict. A stark contrast to the serene, domesticated world that Victoria had cherished and ruled over. The monarchy, though still central to British life, would never again hold the same unchallenged power it had during the Victorian period. As for the empire, it too was in the midst of change. The British Empire, under Victoria, had grown to become the largest empire in history. It was a time of imperial dominance when British influence stretched across the globe, from Canada to India, from Africa to the Pacific Islands. But in the early 20th century, the world began to shift. World War I, which would erupt just a few years after Victoria's death, would change the global landscape forever. The empire that had flourished during her reign began to erode, with many colonies seeking independence and new international powers emerging in the wake of the conflict. Her legacy, however, was more than just political. It was personal. The image of Victoria in black, a widow, a mother, a queen, became iconic, and it was a portrait that lived on in the hearts and minds of those who had grown up under her reign. She had embodied constancy in an ever-changing world, and her role as a figurehead of an empire was a steadying influence in the lives of millions. Her personal life had been filled with moments of great joy, sorrow, and transformation. The loss of her beloved Prince Albert had defined much of her later years, but she had also known the joy of motherhood, of nurturing a family that would go on to shape the future of Europe. Her children and their marriages to royal houses across the continent would tie Britain to a network of kings and queens that spanned generations, earning her the title of Grandmother of Europe. Her role as a matriarch extended beyond her immediate family. She had a unique bond with her people, especially in the later years of her reign. While her public appearances were fewer in the wake of Albert's death, she remained an emblem of the nation's resilience. The public's affection for her never waned, even as the monarchy itself began to take on new forms. In her final years, Victoria had withdrawn from the physical duties of monarchy, but her influence remained profound. The changes she had made, the foundations she had set, had shaped the trajectory of the empire and the monarchy for decades to come. Her reign had seen Britain rise to global prominence, and though the world had moved into a new century, one that would bring more challenges and crises, the legacy of Victoria's steadfastness continued to provide a quiet but important foundation for the country she had ruled for so long. Her death, though a natural part of life, marked a profound shift in how Britain would understand itself. She had been, for so many years, the living embodiment of empire, of nationhood, and of monarchy. Her absence left a void, one that would not be easily filled. Her funeral, held at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, was a simple affair, befitting her wishes for quiet dignity. The world mourned not just the passing of a queen, but the passing of an era. Victoria's legacy was not one of grand speeches or towering monuments, but of steady influence, of a life lived in the service of her people, and of a reign that had shaped the course of history in subtle yet indelible ways. The memory of Victoria remained a comforting presence for many. For years, her name was invoked in speeches, in national celebrations, in the way the British people thought about their past. She was the grandmother of a continent, the mother of an empire, and the queen who had ruled during the most transformative period of modern history. And yet, as the 20th century unfolded, the world changed again. And with it, the role of monarchy began to shift. Victoria's reign had set the stage for the monarchy's enduring place in British life, but it was a place that would soon be tested by the events of war, revolution, and social change. Victoria's death may have marked the end of her personal reign, but it did not mark the end of the influence of her name. For as long as her descendants sat on the throne, they would carry with them the quiet strength of her legacy, a legacy of duty, of love, and of an empire that had once stretched across the globe. Her name would live on, not just in the titles of those who followed her, but in the heart of a nation that had known her as their queen, their symbol, and their constant. Chapter 10. The End of a Quiet Legacy. It was January 22, 1901. The world had changed almost beyond recognition since Queen Victoria's coronation, 63 years earlier. The streets were no longer lit by gas lamps, but by electricity. The railroads stretched across continents, connecting the world in ways unimaginable in her youth. Airships and automobiles were on the horizon, poised to change the way people lived. And though the empire she ruled continued to span the globe, the world around it had begun to move at an astonishing pace, a pace that, in some ways, left even her steadfast rule behind. Yet in the end, Queen Victoria passed as she had lived, quietly. Her death came not with the grandeur or fanfare that some might have expected, but with a sense of quiet inevitability. After a long life filled with both profound personal loss and monumental political change, she slipped away at the age of 81, leaving behind a legacy that was as much about continuity and stability as it was about the endurance of the human spirit. Her last moments were peaceful. Surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she passed in her sleep at Osborne House, the place she had so often sought solace since the death of Albert. For those who knew her best, it was fitting. She had, after all, lived her life with a quiet grace, facing both personal and political challenges with a calmness that never wavered, even in her darkest hours. Her death was not just the passing of a queen, it was the end of an era. The world outside the royal family did not stand still, even as the queen's coffin was prepared. News of her death spread quickly. Flags flew at half-mast. In cities and villages across Britain, people paused to reflect on the woman who had ruled for over 6 decades. To many, she was not just a monarch. She had been the very embodiment of the British Empire, its stability, its strength, its identity. Yet for all the pomp that surrounded her funeral, there was a deep, almost private sense of loss felt by those who had lived under her reign. For Victoria was more than just a monarch. She was a figure whose image had filled the public sphere for as long as most could remember. She had been the constant, the thread that had woven through the fabric of their lives. In her later years, she had become something of a symbol, not of absolute power, but of the enduring nature of the monarchy itself. She had faced the loss of her beloved Albert, the mourning of her children, and the ever-shifting dynamics of a world that was quickly evolving beyond the familiar structures she had once known. And through it all, she had remained. As she passed, it was as if the very pulse of the empire slowed with her. Her death did not signal the end of the monarchy, but it did mark a new beginning, one that would be shaped by her son, Edward VII, who succeeded her. Edward was not the quiet figure his mother had been. He was a man of greater indulgence, of a more modern temperament. His reign would usher in the Edwardian era, a time of change, a time when the rigid Victorian structure would begin to give way to the new century's demands. Victoria's funeral was held at St. Tar, George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. It was a solemn affair, befitting her wishes for quiet dignity. Her body was laid to rest beside Albert, in the royal mausoleum at Frogmore, just as she had desired for so many years. The mourners who filled the chapel that day did not just grieve for the loss of a queen. They mourned the passing of a figure who had been a part of their lives for as long as they could remember. In the years that followed, Queen Victoria's legacy was carried forward in many ways, through the monarchy, through the British Empire, and through the family that had flourished under her watch. Her children and grandchildren continued to play key roles in European royal affairs, and the British royal family, although changed by the times, remained a central figure in the public consciousness. Yet, it was not just through politics and diplomacy that Victoria's influence remained. It was also through her deeply personal legacy. She had been a mother, a wife, and a woman who had lived through profound personal loss. Her letters, her journals, her poetry, all of these gave voice to a queen who had been, above all, human. She had been a woman who had known joy, sorrow, love, and pain, and had carried all of those emotions quietly, as only she could. Her death also marked the end of a quiet period in Britain's history. The world had changed, and the empire would eventually follow suit. The monarchy that had been a symbol of the old order would be challenged by the forces of modernity, and yet it would endure. The lessons of Victoria's reign, of duty, of service, of resilience, would not be forgotten. Her legacy would continue to shape the British monarchy for generations. But for now, as her body was laid to rest beside Albert, and the empire turned its gaze to the new century, there was a sense that the world had lost something irreplaceable. Victoria had lived through the most profound changes the world had ever known, and she had been a steadying force through it all. The empire she had helped to build and the family she had nurtured would carry on in her name. But there was no denying that, in her passing, something deeply significant had been lost. Though her body was gone, her presence continued to linger. Her memory lived in every corner of the empire, in the bustling streets of London, in the quiet courts of India, in the far reaches of Africa, Canada, and Australia. Victoria was gone, but the world she had shaped, the world she had quietly watched over day after day, would not soon forget her. She had been the constant, the quiet, enduring thread. And in the legacy she left behind, her empire, her family, and her people would continue to move forward, slowly, surely, always, with her spirit guiding them.